Awash in evil. London, 1927. Since losing his beloved Deirdre in the Amazon a year ago, Indiana Jones has settled down with his PhD and taught Celtic archaeology, thinking he left adventure behind. Yet Indy is rather tempted when a wild-eyed Russian doctor, Vladimir Zablotsky, tries to recruit him for an expedition to search for Noah's Ark, and then finally takes up the dangerous quest after meeting Vladimir's alluring daughter, Katrina. They set out for Istanbul and then Mount Ararat, fabled location of Noah's Ark, when trouble erupts. Kremlin agents, Sicilian enforcers, and Turkish bandits all attempt to bar Vladimir, Katrina, and Indiana Jones from the archaeological find of the century, and a certain 950-year-old boat builder. Indy Jones thought his adventuring career was all washed up until Indiana Jones and the Genesis Deluge.
Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This video is my review of the fourth in the Bantam Indiana Jones novels, Indiana Jones and the Genesis Deluge, written once again by Rob MacGregor, and sort of picking up where his initial trilogy of books that I've previously reviewed left off. Now, the reason why I say sort of loose trilogy, all of these books are standalone novels, but the first three are rather interconnected, and you do see characters and references made to past events even in the fourth book, so it does help when you read these in order, as they're all prequels taking place primarily in the starting in the 1920s in Peril at Delphi, and then working its way up to the Indy you see in the films. Now, if you've read the first three books or you've seen my videos on them, what you see here in the fourth novel does have a lot of the same style and tendencies. So once again, we have MacGregor focusing on a real grounded search for a historical artifact. It's actually quite a good MacGuffin, I think, actually looking for Noah's Ark itself when a piece of wood, ostensibly from the Ark, turns up and does seem to have some sort of perhaps magical or supernatural or some sort of otherworldly properties, depending on who actually handles it. And there being a real question about, is this merely a fraud? Is this somebody trying to pull something over the archaeological world for monetary gain? Or could Noah's Ark actually still exist? This also finds Indiana Jones at a particular crossroads in his life, because as in the third novel, he had gotten married to Deirdre Campbell, the love interest of the second book, and unfortunately that didn't go very well, so he's still kind of reeling from that. As the actual blurb on the back cover says, he lost her in the jungles during the events of Seven Veils. So he finds himself at sort of a crossroads. He's been teaching Celtic archaeology, and he's sort of going through the motions, and essentially winds up deciding to throw on with this adventure and throw his archaeological professorial career out the window for a time. So this is actually, once again, the best thing about the MacGregor novels, besides the nice grounding and some real historical element, is the sense of Indy's character, and where MacGregor has put him here after being married and now being a widower and sort of not finding any cause to enjoy what he's doing. It's definitely a nice crossroads for Indy at this point, and it provides a nice reason for him to get involved in said adventure. But he doesn't do so immediately, because the whole main first act actually sort of takes an unexpected left turn, because Indy decides he's going to go back home first, and he winds up going back to Chicago and going and looking at the old university he graduated from in the first novel, and tries to get a teaching job there, but due to events of his graduation, people still hold grudges against him. And he also winds up running into his old friend Jack Shannon, his old college buddy, who was a recurring character in the previous three books. And even Jack Shannon's had a bit of a character growth, because not only has he gotten involved in his family's crime activities, because he is actually part of a crime family in Chicago, and he's actually also become very religious, actually, and that's a bit of a left turn, something that's kind of unexpected if you've read the previous three books. It's not necessarily something you'd see this character doing, but it does actually tie into the overall plot. What's really interesting about this whole section of the book that basically underlines that Indy should go on this adventure and also trying to reconnect with his old friend and try and basically save him from himself in a lot of different ways, because the families have gotten in deeper into conflict because you have Al Capone running around Chicago. So basically, this section of the book kind of turns into Indiana Jones and the Untouchables, and it was totally unexpected and actually quite fun. You have Indy going into essentially a mob-owned jazz nightclub, and then he and Jack Shannon getting chased out by gunmen after Shannon, and they duck into a room, which is actually a room in a brothel, and they're like, no, we don't want anything. We just want to hide here. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, then there just happens to be a police raid at the same time. Indy does actually encounter Al Capone in one short scene and gets, almost. He gets the crap beaten out of him. It was completely unexpected, and it was actually rather well done and investing for the reader. It's not something I pictured outside of Indy sort of encountering some Chicago nightclub elements you see in the Young Indiana Jones series. Maybe that was that MacGregor was cognizant of that a little bit and maybe riffing on it a little bit, but it kind of felt like Indiana Jones on a side Untouchables adventure, and basically he and Jack Shannon have to get out of town real fast, and they decide to go on this expedition. Now, the expedition to find Noah's Ark is being run by a rather curious character, Dr. Zablotsky, who actually is a Russian who claims to have originally found the site of Noah's Ark when he was in the Russian army, somewhere on top of Mount Ararat, and he actually brought back a piece of wood that he claims to be from Noah's Ark, and he's kind of seen as a fraud by most archaeologists, and he's thus turned to try and find funding and an archaeologist to go along with him on this expedition wherever he can, and he winds up actually giving a speech at the church Jack Shannon goes to regularly, and Shannon kind of drags Indy along, and that's how Indy gets involved in this whole idea of searching for the lost Ark. Zablotsky also has a beautiful daughter named Katrina, who also not only serves as the love interest, but whenever she holds the piece of wood, she has what seem to be visions, possibly of the future, and that's where the whole notion of the wood possibly being real and possibly having otherworldly properties comes into it. So in that sense, it's maybe a little reminiscent of the Omphalos artifact that MacGregor had introduced in his first book, and when Indy would hold that, he would have weird sort of visions. Now, once all our characters are introduced, they're already kind of in hot water because the other mob factions and Capone's men are out for the Shannon family, and actually there's a rather high body count sort of massacre sequence, which was quite well done and kind of makes you get flashes of Untouchables or even The Godfather. So Jack Shannon has to get out of town real fast. Indy has to get out of town real fast. And it just so happens that Zablotsky and his daughter are kind of being followed by mysterious agents. And so with Indy getting involved with them, now there's like 2 or 3 different factions out for all of these people for different reasons. So essentially they have to get out of town really fast, and they start on this expedition. Of course, both Indy and Jack Shannon are it's kind of weird how it's done. It's a little much, because basically as soon as they see Katrina, they're both obsessed with her, and it's also even more weird because Indy is a widower and he's still mourning the death of his wife in the previous book. So it felt a little weird for him to just automatically be head over heels for this person he just met, and then his best friend is completely obsessed with her too. So then they're kind of like jostling with each other to be noticed for the rest of the actual adventure. So I mean, it's nice to actually have the love interest do something, but it was just kind of weird that just like as soon as they saw her, they were both completely crazy about her, and it just felt a little weird because Indy's supposed to still be grieving because he's a recent widower, and it's weighing on him. So that just felt a little bit rushed, but it's only sort of sporadically brought up through the rest of the book. But that's essentially Katrina's purpose. She is kind of the competition between the two friends, And also, she has the ability to, when she actually holds the plank of wood, she has sort of visions of the future and then has to try and figure out what it was she actually saw and deal with. Now she's got two young dudes lusting after her. As we go across the globe, so this book does have the nice globe-trotting atmosphere that is required for an Indy story. We have all of these other factions trying to keep the expedition from achieving their goal and discovering the Ark. They kind of have different reasons, but the main idea is that you have groups of people not wanting the Ark to be discovered because it has been foretold to lead to a seismic change in humanity, and that might not be a good thing. And some people also view this because of their religious beliefs. So you have sort of two different factions, and the mob antagonists don't really come into play after they leave Chicago. So it's just down to the factions not wanting them to find the Ark at any cost. Now, they are constantly under observation, and then they actually start getting attacked and kidnapped, and there's a lot of actually pretty nice action in this book. The main thing you're going to run into, though, is like Seven Veils, the book that preceded this, the actual adventure portion, the sort of journey and the events to get them to the point of actually getting to possibly Noah's Ark actually takes up the majority of the book. The pacing is actually quite an improvement even over Seven Veils. So I think it builds on Seven Veils to actually keep the reader invested and just keep going through all of the chapters and set pieces before you get to the end and you suddenly realize, hey, we haven't even gotten to the Ark's resting place yet. Like, are we going to get to that? And then that's so the Ark is pretty much saved for, the final climactic moments in about the last 30 pages or so. So unfortunately, there's not a whole lot to actually do with actually getting to what might possibly be the Ark. It's mostly just the journey to try and get there and all the people that are trying to kill them or stop them by killing them. There's also a nice gritty tone in this book. There are quite a number of deaths. There's a pretty decent body count. Indy does curse a number of times, as you'll see him do very rarely in the films. It's when he gets really in the thick of it, and he just lets something come out, and that feels very Indy. So I think that's not only a good character beat that MacGregor picked up from Harrison Ford's performance in the films, but it also is one of those little things that's like, yeah, this is not a kid's novel, because that was something they had to deal with. Actually, for some reason, it was thought by some that these were supposed to be kids' books. So you've got the love interest on the young men's minds constantly. You've got some pretty nice deaths. There's some cursing, and there's even I guess it's technically a sort of torture sequence, because Indy is captured and he's basically shot up with a lot of dope, and he's seeing all kinds of crazy things, and then he'll wake up and then they hit him again. So he's kind of like, it's almost an entire chapter, really, where they're just transporting him, and instead of just tying him up, they literally tie him up and shoot him full of a bunch of dope, and he's basically having a weird sort of trip. And then probably my favorite bit, the most pulpy bit, is and towards the end, they're running around a secret labyrinth of tunnels in an ancient underground city, and they're unable to find their way out, and they're having to make an improvised exit, and they're being chased by the guards, who are actually the Janissaries of history, and or at least the modern equivalent when this book is set of the then current Janissaries carrying on the tradition. But Indy is having to hold them off to let the others escape, and the guards are starting to break through, and they've got their swords, and they're breaking through these clay walls, and Indy's got his whip and he's got a sword, and in the most beautifully pulpy moment, one guy starts to break through, and Indy just chops down, and it literally describes Indy chops the guard's hand off. And it's just like, okay, yes, this is the pulpy stuff I needed. This is what I was looking for. So, to be honest, I think the pacing of Genesis Deluge is the best so far of the MacGregor novels, and I think it's the one you can most easily just get into the thick of it and enjoy reading through it. I do think it still has some of the shortcomings of the earlier books. And also, MacGregor does the thing again where he actually opens the book with a little prologue, but this time it actually isn't about Indy. It's not like the first book where it's an event from later on that he repeats and uses to just open as a prologue. This is actually set years before, and you don't quite know who these characters are at first. It's actually about the army courier in the Russian army who actually gets a hold of the piece of wood that's supposedly from Noah's Ark, and how he's trying to transport it, and how he gets reported to his authorities and actually winds up encountering Trotsky, of all people. So it's an interesting way to open the book, and sets up the idea of how this supposedly, possibly mythical artifact has been recovered earlier, and then how people tried to sort of bury its existence. Also, like in Seven Veils, you've got essentially multiple smaller factions of villains that at least we get a little bit more information about them and what their sort of goals are. It's essentially the different factions want to keep anyone from finding Noah's Ark, primarily for their religious beliefs and what they think that might do to the world at large, or that it's not time to essentially reach Judgment Day because the Ark was possibly discovered. So it's not as effective as I'd like it to be. I wish there was some more about the actual primary villain, and we get to actually meet him so late in the book that it doesn't feel as impactful as it could have been. But it's also the villains in this particular story. Their goals are so specific, and they only sort of get triggered when Indy and company arrive in the country. So it basically is a story that develops as it goes along, and because the pacing is, I think, increased and flows a bit better than the previous three books, I think that helps you more easily go along with things. I also think MacGregor does a great job at giving you the sense of atmosphere, the sense of locale, his descriptions of the hotel they're in Chicago, the city life of Chicago in the 20s, and the overall descriptions of historical periods and the actual period setting of the story, and elements of history is, as always, well done. And in this one, he does a better job at when he's actually discussing the actual history behind certain aspects. In the previous books, it kind of felt like the actual story kind of stopped, and you got a little miniature history, not necessarily a lecture, but it's like suddenly you got a blurb about the actual history of the item or place or people being discussed, and it kind of interrupted the flow of the story a bit. This one, it feels basically a little bit more folded and worked in, and I thought that was an improvement. I do wish that there was a little bit more with the actual arc at the end, and it ends in the way you kind of expect it to. It does feel very fitting, and there's even a nice character beat at the end for our surviving characters. And once again, the best takeaway from the MacGregor novels is his sense of characterization of Indiana Jones himself, and that affects the characters Indy interacts with. So I think that is always spot on. And even if you're not a big fan of his approach to these books, I think everybody can agree his sense of characterization for Indy and Indy's world is spot on. Now to talk about the actual printing, this is the original first printing Bantam Falcon book, with a beautiful Drew Struzan painting for the cover, as all of these feature just gorgeous Struzan artwork. The covers are worth picking up these books for. They're just amazing. And again, there's a sort of wraparound effect with a nice rainbow in the background. So you get this nice sort of panoramic image, and the way he could capture Harrison Ford's expressions is just without parallel. This also being a first printing, there is embossing on the Indiana Jones logo, if you can sort of make that out, that got removed on later printings. And as I've noticed before, all of the little taglines they put on here on the original printings, they all say Indy Jones. And I like that sort of flourish because it does sort of suggest a young Indy or a younger man who's a bit more rough around the edges and he's finding his way. He's not quite fully the Indiana Jones of the films, and that's the fun of reading these books. And so I like that they actually use Indy Jones in the tagline. And then in the back, you have the nice vintage ad for the Lucasfilm fan club and the other previously released Indy books, along with, of course, the author photo and the ad for Heirs to the Empire. So overall, I think Genesis Deluge, the fourth of the Rob MacGregor Indy novels, improves on the previous three in a number of ways. I think it's the best paced so far, and I think this is the one that people can pick up and just jump into the adventure the easiest of the first four. There are still some rough edges here and there, and I do wish the villains were a bit more fleshed out, and the usage of the love interest to generate a sort of rivalry between Indy and his friend Jack Shannon feels a little much, especially since Indy is supposed to be the grieving widower. It felt a bit much, since he's still sort of reeling with that weight on his shoulders. It's also I wish there was more with the finale of actually getting to the Ark site. I don't quite know overall. I still have a good fondness for Seven Veils because that was the only book I had growing up, so it's the one I've actually read before a few times, and I like the stuff that happens with Indy and Deirdre in that book, and I like a lot of the wilder, pulpier aspects of that story, even though I don't think it's as well paced and structured as Genesis Deluge. So I kind of have them on an even level. I love aspects of both of them, but I do think overall they are improvements over the first two books. These are all interesting reads. I think everybody should give them a chance, especially indie fans absolutely should read these. The only problem is they're getting quite difficult to find. They only went through a few print runs, and they never had the success of the Timothy Zahn Star Wars books and the Expanded Universe Star Wars novels. They did get reprinted around the time of Crystal Skull, but it was a very limited sort of reprint, and they kind of came and went fast. And I really wish somebody would talk about these more, or reprint them, especially so people could actually experience them for themselves. Depending on because there are different authors of the Bantam novels, different people who are different fans have very different opinions on which author they prefer. And MacGregor took a certain approach, and then the other authors kind of took different approaches. So it's not like all books in the Bantam series are exactly the same or had the same author. So the MacGregor novels are a particular section, and they pretty much pick up from where his Last Crusade novelization had started his particular style of writing Indy. So it's unfortunate that these books have gotten so hard to find, and basically you kind of have to just comb eBay and used bookstores to find copies that aren't super expensive. But it's definitely worth it. It's a nice sort of archaeological book find to dig up. You kind of feel like that because these are not discussed outside of real diehard indie fan circles, and it did take me a while to find all of them. So that's why I kind of waited until this moment after Dial of Destiny to finally dive in and read all of them in order. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of The Man with the Hat and the Whip and books and just all kinds of other media tied to Indiana Jones has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've read Genesis Deluge, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you're a fan of the MacGregor books or other indie books, I definitely recommend these. It's just very difficult to find them nowadays. So definitely keep your eyes peeled if you're interested in reading these. As always, please do keep supporting independent bookstores wherever possible. Keep reading print books, and thanks ever so much for watching.